Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. The Caribbean has always been a dream destination for tourists from all over the world, with crystal clear waters, blue skies, and a climate that seems to invite happiness. For Sarah Mitchell, a 29-year-old nurse from Boston, this was her first cruise trip. After years of hard work and little play, she finally decided to treat herself to some well-deserved rest. The cruise, named Eternal Paradise, was a huge ship with infinity pools, luxurious restaurants, and elegantly decorated cabins. Sarah embarked enthusiastically, feeling like the protagonist of an adventure film. Little did she know that this trip would be remembered for completely different reasons. The first night on board was perfect. Sarah met other passengers, had dinner in the main restaurant, and watched a show in the ship's theater. Everything seemed magical until, upon returning to his cabin, he noticed something strange. The door was slightly open, although she was sure she had locked it. Cautiously, he entered and turned on the light. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. She locked the door again and tried to ignore the discomfort, chalking it up to the emotion of the day. But when he lay down, he noticed something peculiar, a strange mark on the bedroom mirror. It was like a fingerprint, but bigger and more distorted, as if something or someone had touched the glass with hands that weren't human. Sarah tried to clean the mark, but it wouldn't come off. Uncomfortable, she turned to face the bed, deciding to ignore it. But as I tried to sleep, the sound of slow footsteps echoed through the hallway. They were heavy, dragging, as if someone were walking barefoot. He got up to look through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. However, the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. When they stopped right in front of her door, the air in the cabin became thick, and a cold feeling ran down her spine. Without the courage to open the door, Sarah spent the rest of the night awake, with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to convince herself that she was imagining things. The next morning, Sarah tried to ignore the strange events of the night before. She became convinced that her fatigue and new surroundings had affected her perception. After having breakfast on the main deck, we decided to enjoy the day exploring the ship's activities. A dance class, a swim in the pool, and even a visit to the spa. Everything seemed to return to normal. But when she returned to her cabin in the early afternoon, she found something that made her freeze. On the bedroom mirror, the mark had increased. Now it looked like a more defined blur, almost like a face, albeit distorted and with inhuman features. Sarah felt a wave of panic, but tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a defect in the rearview mirror or a bad joke from another passenger. Determined to solve the problem, she called the cleaning service. A chambermaid named Maria arrived quickly. "We don't often see something like this," said Maria, examining the mirror carefully. When he tried to clean the mark, he noticed that it appeared to be inside the glass, like an embedded stain. Maria crossed her arms, visibly uncomfortable, but said nothing more. Before leaving, however, she looked at Sarah and murmured in Spanish, "Someone was here before you, someone who didn't leave." That night, Sarah went to the formal dinner in the main restaurant. Trying to put the events out of his mind, he sat down with other passengers and started a relaxed conversation. Everyone seemed happy and carefree until an elderly man at the next table mentioned something that caught their attention. "This ship, they say it has stories, people who disappeared. A crew member once said that this is why some cabins stay empty for so long." Sarah felt her heart tighten, but tried not to react. When he casually asked for more details, the man just shrugged and changed the subject, as if he didn't want to talk about it in public. Back in his cabin, the discomfort returned with a vengeance. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, but now there was something more. The sound of footsteps in the hallway was back. This time, they seemed to come from multiple directions, as if several people were walking at once. Sarah looked through the peephole again, but the hallway was empty. When he got back inside, the cabin light flickered, and a low noise began to echo, as if someone was whispering in the distance. She tried calling the ship's reception desk, but the line was out of service. Suddenly, the bathroom door closed with a bang on its own, and the sound of running water began to come from inside. Summoning all her courage, Sarah slowly opened the door. The bathroom was empty, but the mirror over the sink now displayed a sentence written in runny letters. "I am here." The next day, Sarah decided to investigate. He spoke to Maria, the chambermaid, who hesitated before revealing what she knew. Many years ago, a passenger disappeared in this exact cabin. Nobody knows what happened. He was last seen in the hallway, at night, walking aimlessly. When they tried to locate him, he was already gone. The only thing they found was a trail of water on the ground, as if he had gone into the sea. Sarah tried to argue that there must be a logical explanation, but Maria shook her head. Some people say he never left. Who still walks the halls at night, looking for someone to take him along. Maria's words echoed in Sarah's mind as she spent the day trying to avoid going back to the cabin. But at night, when there was no more activity on the ship, he realized he had no choice. That night, events became more intense. The sound of footsteps no longer just came from the hallway. Now it seemed to be inside the cabin itself. The light flickered constantly, and the temperature dropped, as if a current of cold air had invaded the space. Sarah tried to sleep, but was woken up in the middle of the night by a loud, sharp sound, as if something had fallen. When he opened his eyes, he saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. She was tall and stooped, with a dark, indistinct silhouette. She blinked, and the figure disappeared, but the terror remained. Feeling like she couldn't stay there any longer, Sarah ran into the hallway but tripped and fell. When she looked back, she saw wet handprints on the floor, slowly following her. Sarah ran down the ship's corridor, her footsteps echoing as she tried to escape the invisible terror that followed her. The wet handprints on the floor seemed to multiply, forming a trail that followed her at every turn. Her heart was racing, and the sound of her own footsteps was drowned out by the sound of something dragging behind her, as if something very heavy was moving slowly. She made it to the main lobby, where the bright lighting and ambient music made her feel safe for a brief moment. Passengers were still chatting animatedly in the bars and lounges, completely oblivious to what was happening. Sarah tried to explain to a security guard what she had seen, but he just smiled politely. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said. "The old cabins have some plumbing issues. Sometimes the water runs down and makes it look like someone walked by." Sarah knew better. This wasn't a plumbing problem. Something deeper and more terrible was happening. Unable to get help, Sarah remembered the elderly man who had mentioned stories about the ship during dinner. Determined to find out more, she looked for him in the lounge area. After a brief search, he found him sitting at a table with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I need you to tell me what you know about this ship," Sarah pleaded, sitting down next to him. The man hesitated, but the look on his face showed he knew more than he was willing to share. After a few seconds, he sighed deeply. "You're staying in one of the old cabins, aren't you?" he asked. Sarah confirmed with a nod. "This ship has a history that the crew doesn't like to talk about. Years ago, a man disappeared during a storm. He was in that booth. Cameras in the hallway showed him leaving and walking directly onto the deck, but no one saw him jump. When they looked for him, all they found were wet handprints." Sarah felt her stomach drop. That's exactly what was happening to her. "Why is he still here?" he asked, his voice cracking. The man looked around, as if afraid someone would hear him. "They say he was lonely, but also furious. He was seen arguing with the crew days before he disappeared. Perhaps he decided to take others with him, so as not to be alone." Back in her cabin, Sarah found the door ajar. She hesitated, but knew she needed to go inside. As he crossed the threshold, he felt a wave of intense cold. The light was dim, and shadows seemed to move on the walls. In bed, a new detail made her freeze. There was a pool of dark water, with a slight salty smell, like the sea. Above the puddle, a small piece of paper was wet but readable. The words on it said, "Come on deck." Sarah tried to ignore it, but an inexplicable force seemed to pull her out. The sound of footsteps and scratches now came from inside the cabin, and a shadow larger than the previous ones began to form in the corner of the room. Not knowing what to do, Sarah took the paper and ran away again. This time it headed straight for the deck. The wind was strong, and the sound of waves echoed around her as Sarah crossed the deck. There was almost no one there, just the sea, as dark as the starless sky. The ship's lights flickered intermittently, and the sound of wet footsteps followed closely behind. She finally stopped near the edge, looking out to sea. It was as if she was hypnotized, unable to look away. A low, guttural voice whispered in his ear, "You came." Sarah spun around quickly, but there was no one there. The water seemed to rise along the sides of the ship, forming little hands that grabbed the handrail, as if something was trying to emerge from the depths. The sound of low, haunting laughter filled the air, and finally Sarah saw the figure. It was a dark silhouette, with eyes that shined like rusty headlights. Its form was humanoid but disfigured, with long, crooked limbs. "You shouldn't have come," said the figure, with a voice that seemed to carry the pain of 1,000 souls. Sarah tried to run, but the wind got stronger, almost knocking her over. The figure didn't move, but the feeling of something pulling it toward the edge was undeniable. Desperate, Sarah shouted, "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, as if analyzing her. "The loneliness is unbearable," he replied. "You came. Now it will be." Sarah realized he wanted to take her with him, drag her out to sea, as he had done to so many others before her. But before he could react, the figure disappeared, and the sound of distant footsteps and laughter began again. Sarah knew it wasn't over. The deck was empty except for the sound of the strong wind and the roar of the sea around the ship. Sarah stood there, frozen, as she tried to understand what was happening. The feeling of biting cold passed through her body, and the darkness of the ocean seemed to watch her like a living abyss. The ship's lights flickered again, leaving her in a play of shadows and flashes that made everything even more surreal. She tried to move, but fear held her in place. Something invisible seemed to surround her, an overwhelming presence that took away her strength. The water rising up the sides of the ship seemed alive, forming shapes that resembled indistinct hands, arms, and faces. The surrounding sound became chaotic. Whispers, distant laughter, and the constant echo of heavy footsteps mixed together, creating a cacophony that filled every corner of the deck. Suddenly the air became still. The wind ceased, the noise of the waves disappeared, and everything became absolutely silent. Sarah looked around, trying to understand what had happened. The deck seemed longer than before, as if it had extended beyond the confines of the ship. As she tried to move away, her feet met resistance. The floor was wet, slippery, and seemed to absorb his movements, making each step more difficult. She felt her heart race again when she noticed wet footprints appearing around her, forming a circle that slowly closed. The blurs of water on the ground began to glow with a faint blue hue, like the bioluminescence of the ocean floor. The glow increased, forming symbols that Sarah didn't recognize but that looked ancient, like runes carved in water. Symbols began to move, as if the ground were alive. That's when she saw the silhouette again, clearer this time. The figure stood at the end of the deck, partially covered in darkness, but the glowing eyes and distorted outline were unmistakable. She felt a crushing weight on her chest, as if the very air around her was being sucked away. Sarah tried to run, but her feet felt stuck. She looked down and saw that wet handprints had crept up through the floor, gripping her ankles like claws made of water. His mind screamed for a solution, but his body was paralyzed, caught between logic and pure terror. The figure began to move, slowly and deliberately. Each step seemed to echo throughout the deck, although the distance between them was impossible to calculate. There was no sound of breathing, nor any movement other than footsteps. Just that oppressive glow in her eyes, and the feeling that something terribly ancient was watching her. As the figure approached, the ground beneath Sarah began to shake. The wood seemed to pulse, as if it had a heart of its own. The water around him began to rise, covering his feet and spreading across the deck. The feeling of being swallowed by the ocean became more and more real. The ship's lights flickered frantically until finally they went out completely. Sarah was enveloped by a darkness so thick it seemed tangible, as if it could touch her. The only thing visible was the glow of the figure's eyes, now so close that she could feel the overwhelming presence around her. The entire deck began to change. The metal and wooden structures seemed to dissolve, transforming into something more organic. The ground now looked like living coral, covered in sea moss and mollusks. The smell of salt and decay filled the air, suffocating her. Sarah knew she was being pulled into something beyond the physical, something she couldn't understand. It was as if the ship was transforming into an extension of the very entity that pursued it, a limbo between the world of the living and the deep. The figure finally stopped before her. Even without a face, there was something undeniably human about his posture, as if he were studying Sarah, gauging her resistance. The water around her rose quickly, reaching her knees, and she realized she was about to be consumed. Suddenly, the glowing marks on the ground began to emit a low, pulsing sound like a drum. The surrounding water bubbled, and the figure began to merge with the surrounding shadows. Everything seemed to spin, as if Sarah was at the center of a whirlpool as the gravity around her disappeared. She closed her eyes, trying to fight the panic. But the last thing he felt before losing consciousness was the water rising up to his neck, cold and unforgiving, while the distant laughter echoed like an eternal lament. Sarah woke up in a place that didn't seem real. The ship's deck had disappeared, and she now found herself in an underwater landscape. The floor was made of damp sand and dotted with the remains of broken shells, while pillars of coral and floating algae surrounded the room. The sky above was a whirlwind of liquid darkness, pulsing as if it were alive. The air was thick and cold, and each breath felt like a painful effort. Despite being submerged, she was able to breathe, but she felt that each inhale drained part of her energy. In the distance, she saw slowly moving shapes, indistinct figures that seemed to be made of shadows and water. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Walking hesitantly, he noticed that his footprints were erased almost instantly, as if the ground didn't want to leave traces of his presence. Suddenly, the same figure that had tormented her on deck began to emerge from the shadows. This time, his appearance was even more frightening. Its eyes glowed brightly, and its body looked like a grotesque fusion of flesh, water, and coral. He didn't walk, he floated slowly, as if the environment obeyed his will. Sarah felt an overwhelming panic as she realized there was nowhere to run. The space around her seemed infinite, but at the same time claustrophobic. The ground began to tremble slightly, and fissures opened, releasing a blue-green glow that illuminated the room with a ghostly light. The shadows that were once just figures in the distance began to approach. Now Sarah could see that they were people, or at least what was left of them. Their faces were distorted, as if they had been shaped by water and time, and their eyes were hollow. Some extended their hands, while others just watched, motionless. She tried to step back, but the shadows continued to surround her. Their murmurs grew louder, forming a chorus of voices that sounded like a mixture of crying and anger. When Sarah finally stumbled and fell, the main figure stopped in front of her, leaning slightly, as if sizing up its prey. As she stared at the figure, Sarah was hit by a flood of images that invaded her mind like memories that weren't hers. She saw a man walking alone through the corridors of a ship similar to the one she was on. He seemed agitated, struggling with something invisible. Then she saw the moment he entered the deck during a storm, his expression marked by despair, before disappearing into the raging waters. The images have changed. She saw other people, passengers like her, being drawn to that same destination. Some tried to fight, while others surrendered without resistance. It was an endless cycle, and now she was next. Sarah realized that the figure before her was the fusion of all those lost souls, transformed into something far beyond human understanding. Whatever it was, it not only inhabited the depths of the ocean, but also fed on loneliness and despair. As the shadows around her approached, Sarah felt the sand beneath her feet begin to give way, as if she were being sucked into an abyss. The central figure raised an arm, and the ground around him began to crack, revealing an intense light that seemed to pull him in with force. She knew there was no way to escape, but something inside her made her resist. Fighting the crushing weight of the presence around her, Sarah tried to retreat, but her strength was quickly fading. The shadows finally reached her, grabbing her arms and legs, pinning her down as the main figure watched in silence. Then everything stopped. The environment became completely still, and Sarah realized that there were only two options: surrender or fight until the last moment. She tried to get up, but the murmurs from the shadows grew again, forming words that echoed in her mind. "You can't escape. You belong to us." The fissures in the floor opened completely, and Sarah was pulled into the bright light below her. The sensation was of being dragged to the bottom of an infinite ocean, while the screams of lost souls echoed around her. When everything stopped, Sarah was back on the ship's deck. But something was different. The atmosphere was heavy, and the passengers and crew seemed unaware of his presence. She tried to talk to the people around her, but no one listened or responded. Walking down the hallway towards her cabin, she saw something that made her stop. In the cabin mirror, his reflection was distorted, with his eyes glowing the same bluish tone as the shadows. Sarah realized with a chill that she hadn't escaped. She was now part of the cycle, doomed to wander the ship like so many others before her, waiting for the next soul to be taken from the depths. The crew's Eternal Paradise arrived at its destination in Grand Cayman Harbor the next morning. Passengers disembarked excitedly, many commenting on the beauty of the blue sea and the incredible experience on board. For them, nothing extraordinary had happened during the trip. While the crew was cleaning the cabins and preparing the ship for the next group of tourists, a chambermaid entered the cabin where Sarah had stayed. The room was empty, but something caught his attention: the mirror, where a slight mark seemed to form an almost imperceptible fingerprint. When the maid tried to clean it, she realized that the mark was inside the glass, as if it were part of it. He frowned but didn't pay much attention and continued his work. Meanwhile, Sarah was there, invisible to everyone's eyes. She walked through the ship like a shadow. Her presence felt only by those sensitive enough to notice the sudden cold or the sounds of footsteps in the void. For the first few days, Sarah desperately tried to communicate, but no one would listen to her. His voice was just an echo that disappeared into the wind. Little by little, she realized that she was trapped, no longer alive but still conscious. The ship was now her prison, an extension of the entity that had consumed her. As she walked through the halls at night, she saw new souls arriving, laughing and having fun, completely oblivious to the fate that might await them. She tried to warn them, but it was useless. Weeks later, during a new cruise, a young couple was assigned to the same cabin where Sarah had stayed. On the first day, everything seemed normal, but at night, the woman woke up feeling like she was being watched. When she looked in the mirror, she saw something that made her scream. A silhouette in the reflection, eyes glowing blue, looking straight at her. The couple asked to change cabins, but the strange events continued. Other passengers reported the sounds of heavy footsteps in the hallways at night, doors opening and closing on their own, and an inexplicable feeling of cold. The crew, already accustomed to similar stories, ignored the reports. For them, they were just superstitions or the fertile imagination of tourists. But some knew the truth. There were cabins that were always avoided, but which inevitably ended up being occupied. Sarah became part of the ship, an invisible but constant presence. She was not alone. The other lost souls, shadowy figures that now roamed the corridors and deck, shared his silent existence. Every now and then she would find herself on deck again, looking out to sea. I always felt the call of the depths, but I knew I could never go back to what I was before. That night, as the moon shone brightly in the sky, the familiar sound of wet footsteps echoed through the hall. A new passenger was being chosen. The cycle was repeating itself, and Sarah knew she couldn't do anything to stop it. Years later, the Eternal Paradise was retired, anchored in a remote harbor as a tourist attraction. Visitors loved exploring the ship's corridors, listening to the stories of the souls that supposedly roamed it. But for those who dared to spend the night on board, the stories were not just legends. Many have reported hearing footsteps at night, feeling the chilly air, and occasionally seeing eyes glowing in the mirror. And for Sarah, time continued, still and eternal, as she waited for the next soul to be drawn to the dark destination she now called home. Before we go any further, if you like my content like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what time you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without more interruptions, let's move on to the next story. The Cruise Sea Serpent, a luxury ship that cruised the calm waters of the Caribbean, was famous for its extravagant parties, impeccable cuisine, and paradisiacal excursions. For those who embarked, the promise was of uninterrupted fun and a well-deserved rest amid the beauty of the ocean. Victor, a young man who recently graduated in photography, decided to save up and embark on a cruise as part of his new adventure. He planned to capture the idyllic landscapes and create an impressive portfolio to boost his career. Excited, he boarded the ship with his camera and a smile on his face, hoping for peaceful and memorable days. The first few days were everything he had imagined. Victor explored every corner of the ship, capturing the elegant architecture and joyful moments of the passengers. But as he explored the lower decks in search of unique angles, he found something that immediately caught his attention. A cabin with a partially open door, located in a not-so-trafficked corridor. Curious, he approached. On the floor, there was a thin layer of water that appeared to have flowed from inside the cabin. Victor slowly pushed the door open, revealing an empty, abandoned space. The bed was unmade, as if someone had left in a hurry, and a musty, salty smell filled the air. On the table, he saw a handwritten note, with words almost erased, "Don't open it. Don't look at it." Before he could process what that meant, he heard a noise behind him. When he turned around, the hallway was empty, but the sound of something heavy being dragged echoed in the distance. Victor felt a shiver, but he convinced himself that he was imagining things. He returned to his cabin, determined to forget what had happened. But that night, as he was reviewing the photos on his camera, he noticed something strange. In one of the images captured in the hallway, there was a blurred silhouette, as if someone was standing in the background, watching him. The next morning, Victor tried to ignore the discomfort caused by the photo. He convinced himself it was just an equipment failure or a reflection from the dimly lit hallway. Determined to enjoy the trip, he continued exploring the ship and interacting with other passengers, but something seemed different. During breakfast on the main deck, he noticed that many passengers avoided talking about the lower decks. When Victor casually commented on the corridor where he had found the open cabin, the gazes around him became uneasy. Some passengers exchanged whispers, while others simply got up and left. An older waiter, upon hearing the conversation, approached with a serious face. "Some places on this ship are best left untouched," he said, almost in a whisper, before quickly walking away. Victor felt his curiosity growing, but also a latent fear that he couldn't explain. He tried to get back to his routine, but as the day progressed, strange little events began to accumulate. While photographing the sunset from the bow of the ship, Victor heard a sound coming from the lower deck. It was a rhythmic noise, like something heavy hitting the ground, mixed with a scratching sound that went up the ship's hull. When he looked down, he only saw the darkness of the sea and the reflection of the water against the ship. Determined to find out what was going on, he went down to the lower decks again that night. The corridor where he had found the open cabin was lit by a dim, intermittent light, creating shadows that seemed to move. When he reached the cabin, he found the door closed. But on the floor, the water that was previously present had spread, forming a trail that followed along the corridor. He tracked it to a locked door, marked with a sign that said "Restricted Access." The sound of something heavy dragging came again, louder this time, coming from the other side of the door. Victor backed away, but as he did so, he heard a banging sound, as if something or someone was trying to get out. Back in his own cabin, Victor tried to focus on reviewing the photos he had taken that day, but his body felt restless. Every sound on the ship, the creaking of wood, the faint sound of waves lapping against the hull, seemed amplified. As he reviewed the images, something caught his attention. In one of the photos taken in the lower corridor, the same blurred silhouette appeared again. This time it was closer, almost in the center of the image. He zoomed in and noticed frightening details. The figure appeared elongated, with unnaturally long arms and a hunched posture. But the most disturbing thing was the face, or lack thereof. Where the eyes and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, indistinct surface. Panic began to take over, but before I could think about turning off the camera, the cabin light flickered and went out completely. At the same moment, Victor heard a knocking sound on the door. The sound was rhythmic and heavy, as if someone was knocking hard. He hesitated before opening it, but when he looked through the peephole, he saw no one. When he carefully opened the door, he found the hallway empty. But there were wet footprints on the floor, heading toward the deck. Victor followed the trail, unable to resist his curiosity. He felt intensely cold as he climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the deck, he found it completely deserted except for the sound of the wind and waves in the distance. The trail of water ended at the ship's railing, where a figure stood with its back to it, looking out to sea. She was tall, still, and her body seemed covered in something that glittered in the moonlight. Victor tried to speak, but his voice broke. As he took a step forward, the figure slowly turned around. It was the same being he had seen in the photo, now standing before him, with arms outstretched and a presence that seemed to suck in all the air around him. Before Victor could react, the figure took a step towards him, and the temperature plummeted. He felt something cold and wet touch his arm, like fingers clinging to him. Victor ran back to his cabin, locking the door behind him. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, but he knew it wasn't human. He began scouring photos and the internet for clues as to what could be happening. Similar encounters, reports of unexplained disappearances, and stories of hauntings aboard the Sea Serpent began to emerge. One article in particular caught his attention. Years ago, a passenger disappeared after being seen walking through the lower decks. His last appearance was in front of the same cabin where Victor found the note. The story was always the same. Someone found something strange on the ship, was drawn to the lower decks, and eventually disappeared without a trace. Victor knew he needed to get out of there, but the next port was still 2 days away. He decided that he would not sleep again until he could get off the ship. Victor spent the night awake, sitting in the corner of his cabin with the camera at his side and his heart racing. With every sound from the ship, the creaking of wood, the wind beating in the windows, the gentle rumble of water against the hull, he grew more tense. The images on the camera continued to haunt him, but not as much as the certainty that something was watching his every move. Around 3 a.m., he heard again the sound that terrified him, heavy, shuffling footsteps coming from the corridor. He held his breath, waiting for them to pass, but the footsteps stopped right in front of his door. For minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then, 3 slow and steady knocks echoed. Victor was paralyzed, unable to move. A slight drip began, as if something was dripping on the other side of the door. He looked down and saw a small trickle of water coming through the crack. Gathering his courage, he looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, But as he looked away, he heard the sound of something scratching the wood of the door, as if long claws were slowly sliding across the surface. Victor backed away, breathing heavily. The cabin light flickered violently before going out completely. As darkness took over, he felt the presence again. It was oppressive, crushing, as if the air around him had been sucked out. In the morning, Victor knew he couldn't stay in the cabin. He needed to understand what was happening and find a way to escape. He took his camera and went down to the lower decks again, where it had all started. The hallway was even darker than before. The lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. The water that used to run down the floor now formed larger puddles, almost like small lakes that reflected the ceiling and walls in a distorted way. When he arrived at the mysterious cabin, he found the door ajar again. This time, however, there was something on the floor, a wristwatch still working although wet. Victor bent down to pick it up and noticed something written on the inside of the bracelet. A name, David R., and the date of 2004. He immediately remembered the article he had read the night before. David R. was the name of the passenger who had disappeared years ago. When he got up, he felt the air turn cold. The cabin before him seemed to breathe, its walls creaking softly, as if they were alive. He knew going in there was a bad idea, but something was pulling at him, an invisible force he couldn't resist. Inside the cabin, everything was as he had left it the first time. The unmade bed, the smell of salt and mold, and the humidity running down the walls. But this time, in the mirror, there was something different. Words began to form slowly, written by invisible hands. "You're next." Victor stumbled back, but before he could leave the cabin, the door slammed shut. The light disappeared, and he was swallowed by darkness. The sound of water began to echo around, rising through the floor, while the air was filled with the smell of sea air. A wave of images invaded his mind. He saw flashes of faces, people he didn't recognize, all with expressions of terror. They were passengers like him, all drawn to the same destination. They walked through the halls, calling for help, but no one could hear them. Victor finally understood. The ship was trapped in an endless cycle, feeding on the souls of its most curious passengers, those who dared descend to the lower decks. The entity inhabiting the ship used their desperation to grow, and he had fallen directly into the trap. When the lights flickered again, Victor saw the figure. It was in the corner of the cabin, brighter than before. Its long, curved arms dripped with water, and its featureless face seemed to glow with a blue-green light. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. The figure slowly advanced, each step causing the floor to creak and the water level to rise. Victor tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The water was now knee-deep, cold, and heavy, making it difficult to move. The figure extended an arm, and he felt an invisible force pull him toward the center of the cabin. In the mirror, new words appeared. "Come with me." The water rose up to his waist, and Victor felt his body begin to give way. He knew he was being taken, but something inside him still fought. He grabbed his camera and began frantically taking photos, hoping to leave some evidence of what had happened. The last thing he saw before being submerged was the glow from the figure's eyes, illuminating the room with an icy, cruel light. The corridor on the lower deck was enveloped in dense darkness, where the shadows seemed to have a life of their own. Victor advanced slowly, guided by the flickering light from the ceiling that barely illuminated the wet floor. The walls creaked slightly, as if the ship itself was writhing around it. He felt the weight of the air, as if he were being watched by something that never slept. The open cabin was a constant presence in his mind, but this time, as he got closer, the smell of salt had intensified. He noticed that the water accumulated on the floor was now moving, forming small ripples, as if something was moving inside it. When Victor entered the cabin, everything seemed different. The air was freezing, and the walls seemed closer, almost compressing the space. The bed was still unmade, but now there was an object on it. A camera, old and rusty, as if it had been taken from the depths of the sea. He picked up the camera carefully, and felt an intense cold run through his body. As he looked through the lens, he saw something that wasn't there before. The captured image showed the room's reflection in the mirror, but in the corner there was a figure, an elongated shadow, motionless, looking directly at him. Victor backed away, but the cabin door closed with a bang, and the light blinked frantically. The sound of water echoed again, but this time it seemed to come from within the walls, as if the ship was flooding from the inside. The ground began to shake, and fissures appeared beneath their feet, releasing a bluish mist that filled the air with a metallic smell. He felt something touch his shoulder, a cold, clammy sensation that made him turn quickly, but there was nothing there. When trying to open the door, Victor realized he was trapped. The cabin seemed to take on a life of its own, with the walls pulsing slightly and the water level rising rapidly. He started to feel panic, but he knew he needed to find a way out before it was too late. In the corner of the room, the camera he had found made a sound, like a click, taking a photo by itself. When he looked at the viewfinder, he saw the figure again, but now it was closer, almost touching his reflection. The cabin mirror began to break, forming cracks that spread quickly. Through the cracks, Victor saw something impossible: the ocean deep and dark on the other side of the glass. A wave of salt water erupted, flooding the room and pushing him against the wall. The ground beneath his feet gave way, and Victor was dragged under, plunged into liquid darkness. He tried to swim, but the water was heavy, as if it was filled with something invisible that was pulling him. The sensation of drowning was accompanied by visions of distorted faces, trapped at the bottom of the ocean, all with expressions of eternal terror. Suddenly, everything was quiet. Victor opened his eyes and realized he was back in the cabin, now completely dry. The mirror was intact, but in it, he saw something that made him shudder. It wasn't his reflection. It was a reflection of the figure that was chasing him, smiling, as if he had taken his place. Victor was in a state of complete despair. The cabin seemed to have swallowed him, and every time he tried to escape, the weather around him changed shape. The walls were covered in watermarks, and the smell of sea air made the air almost unbreathable. He realized that he was no longer in an ordinary space. The ship had transformed into something alive, something that wanted him for its own. The old camera, which he had found on the bed, was still in his hand, as if it were the only thing that made sense in that distorted place. He tried to use it again, taking photos blindly, but the images that appeared on the display were not of the cabin where he was. They showed the bottom of the sea, full of shadows that moved slowly, like bodies trapped in a lifeless space. The ground beneath his feet began to shift. The cabin's carpet was gone, replaced by a damp wooden surface covered in what looked like sea moss. He tried to move, but his feet were getting stuck, as if the ground was swallowing him. The water began to rise again, but this time it came from the walls, running in rivulets that met in the center of the room. In the mirror's reflection, he saw the figure once again. Now it wasn't stopped. She walked slowly towards him, but not inside the cabin, inside the mirror. Victor tried to turn around to run away, but realized that the figure was in every corner. There wasn't a point in the room where she wasn't present. She seemed to multiply, her shadows covering the walls, the ceiling, and even the water that rose to her ankles. He started to run, but each door he opened didn't take him to a hallway or other space on the ship. Instead, he was thrown back into the same cabin, now completely flooded. The sound of rhythmic tapping filled the space, mixed with the creaking of wood and the echo of distant whispers. The air grew heavier, and Victor realized that the cabin was closing in around him. The walls pulsed, as if space itself were alive, slowly compressing it. He held the camera tightly and tried to capture anything that could serve as evidence of what was happening. Each click of the camera revealed something more disturbing. Distorted faces began to appear on the display, all looking directly at him. They were pale, with empty eyes, but filled with silent despair. They seemed to be trapped, just like him, but there was something more. They were trying to warn him, but Victor couldn't understand the meaning. The water was now waist-high, icy and heavy, making it difficult to move. The sound of whispers increased, turning into a unison scream, like a chorus of voices calling for help. He tried to resist, but he felt an invisible force grabbing him by the shoulders, pulling him to the ground. The reflection in the mirror began to change. The previously indistinct figure now had a clearer face, his. Victor saw his own reflection smiling evilly as he struggled to stay conscious. The figure in the mirror began to move independently, as if it was mocking him. When he finally lost his strength, the water rose above his head, and everything went dark. Victor woke up in complete silence, surrounded by liquid darkness. I didn't know if I was underwater or in some space outside of reality. Everything around him was cold and dense, and the air seemed non-existent. When he tried to move, he realized that something was binding his arms and legs, like invisible chains that stretched beyond the range of his vision. He looked up and saw something extraordinarily frightening. What appeared to be the ceiling of the ship had turned into a dark abyss, where tiny lights twinkled like stars, but there was no sky, just an endless expanse of undulating shadows. He felt the ship pulsing around him, each beat echoing like a gigantic heart, slow and relentless. The surrounding water was not just water. She moved against him, pressing against his body with invisible waves, as if she were alive. Faces began to appear on the surface around them, like reflections in a distorted mirror. They seemed to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if their souls were trapped in water, condemned to eternal silence. Victor tried to free himself, but the more he struggled, the more the invisible chains tightened. The feeling of dread was growing, an overwhelming certainty that he was lost, trapped in something far beyond understanding. He felt like he wasn't just a place, he was a being. The ship, the sea, the abyss, everything was alive and slowly consuming him. Suddenly the silence was broken by a deep sound, something like the roar of a colossal creature. He looked around, but there was nothing visible but darkness. However, the sound grew louder, reverberating in his mind, until he felt as if his head was going to explode. The surface of the water around him began to move. The distorted figures that were once just reflections now emerged, revealing deformed bodies and faces frozen in expressions of eternal terror. They began to pull him down, their icy hands gripping his arms and legs. He tried to fight, but it was useless. The figures dragged him to the bottom, where Victor saw something that terrified him more than anything. There was an opening, a portal of blue-green light that pulsed like a giant eye, watching him. The light seemed to pull him in, while the figures around him murmured silently, their faces filled with despair and resignation. The portal seemed to whisper to him, not with words, but with a clear intention. This was the fate of everyone who had fallen into the ship's trap. There was no escape, only eternity in the void. Victor realized he was being pulled in, and the force was irresistible. The moment he was swallowed by the light, he felt an indescribable pain, as if his essence was being ripped out of his body. Memories began to disappear, one by one, leaving only disconnected fragments. He saw flashes of his childhood, faces of loved ones, and happy moments, but they all disappeared quickly, like sand slipping through his fingers. When the light completely enveloped him, Victor realized that there was no longer a body, just a floating consciousness. He was now part of the ship, the cycle, the entity that consumed everything it touched. On deck, the Sea Serpent continued its route through the Caribbean. For the passengers, everything seemed normal. Music played in the bars, children played in the pools, and the crew did their work with smiles on their faces. But on the lower decks, things were not so calm. The cabin where Victor had disappeared now seemed sealed, locked from the inside, with an eerie silence emanating from it. The lights in the hallway kept flickering, and the sound of wet footsteps could be heard by those brave enough to venture into that area. Victor's camera, which he had taken with him, mysteriously appeared at the entrance to the hallway. One of the crew found her and took her to the lost and found office. When the team tried to access the photos, the equipment failed, but the images were already recorded. Among them were several blurry photos of empty corridors, the dark ocean, and the distorted figure that had chased Victor. But the last photo was different. It showed Victor's reflection in the mirror, but with eyes glowing blue-green and a sinister smile that didn't belong to him. Weeks later, another curious passenger was assigned to the same cabin. Like Victor, he felt the strange cold, heard the sounds in the hallway, and found inexplicable marks on the walls and floor. The cycle began again, and the ship's entity continued to feed. Victor was now part of it, a shadow at the bottom of the ship, silently waiting for the next soul to be consumed. The ship, the sea, and the abyss were interconnected, an eternal cycle of terror and loneliness that could never be broken. The Sea Serpent continued its peaceful route through the Caribbean, carrying hundreds of passengers oblivious to what was happening in the darkest corners of the ship. The cycle was intact, an invisible machine that fed on the curious souls and shadows that inhabited the lower decks. The morning after Victor disappeared, no one seemed to notice his absence. His name was not called in the daily announcements, and his cabin was quickly rearranged by the crew. For the rest of the passengers, he was just another face lost in the crowd embarking and disembarking at the port. On the lower decks, however, the cabin where it all began seemed more alive than ever. The light in the hallway flickered constantly, and the sound of dripping water filled the silence. The cabin door remained locked, but for those who dared to pass by, it was impossible to ignore the cold emanating from it. The crew avoided that corridor, but rumors spread among them. Some said they had heard heavy footsteps in the early hours of the morning, while others swore they had seen shadows moving beneath the door. But no one talked about it out loud. The following night, as the ship passed through an area of deeper water, a passenger exploring the lower decks found something curious. On the floor near the sealed cabin was a trail of wet footprints that seemed to move in circles. They started in the middle of the hallway and disappeared into the darkness, as if the person who made them had never gotten anywhere. When he tried to take a photo with his cell phone, the flash failed, and the captured image was just a blur. Frightened, he ran back to the upper decks, determined not to return to that place. Weeks later, the Sea Serpent welcomed a new group of passengers. Among them, a young woman named Elena, who embarked on a search for some peace after a difficult period in her life. She was assigned to the same cabin where Victor had disappeared, unaware of the stories surrounding that place. On the first night, Elena noticed that the room seemed colder than the rest of the ship. She felt a slight dampness in the air, as if she were near the sea, even though she was on one of the innermost floors. During the early hours of the morning, he woke up to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, followed by a light scratching on his cabin door. When he opened his eyes, he saw water marks on the floor, forming a path that led directly to his bed. Elena stood up, feeling her heart beat faster. When she looked in the bathroom mirror, she saw something that left her speechless. It wasn't her reflection that was there, but a familiar figure. It was Victor, with eyes glowing blue-green and a dark expression. He didn't move, but his presence was suffocating, as if he was calling her to something she didn't understand. The next morning, the crew found the cabin empty. The bed was intact, the mirror was clean, but the wet footprints leading to the deck were still there. The cycle continued, relentlessly, while the Sea Serpent followed its course, sailing between the world of the living and the unknown.